la séance.
We are going to resume the meeting pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on January 29th, 2024. The committee will be beginning its study on the experience of Indigenous and Black veterans. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and I would like to remind everyone that all questions and comments must be addressed through the chair.
The witnesses are, as an individual, we have by video conference from New Brunswick, Mr. Todd Ross, and with us today from the Canadian War Museum, Mrs. Danielle Taylor. She's an historian, and I'd like to thank you parce que vous avez accepté notre...
Thank you for accepting to be with us with this short deadline. I would like to now invite Mr. Ross to make his opening remarks. You have up to 5 minutes, and after that, we will give the floor to Ms. Taylor before we move on to questions.
The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Tanshi Kiwa, Wabanakwat, Dishinakashon, and Michif Ni. My name is Todd Ross. I introduce myself with my spirit name in Michif, and I'm joining you today from the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Wolastoqiyik in Monaquesk, now known as St. John. I'm a Red River Métis, a veteran, two-spirited, and I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. I want to thank you to the committee and to the members for creating this opportunity to speak on the experiences of Indigenous veterans. I bring a unique experience as a two-spirit Métis veteran that was part of the LGBT purge. I want to chat with you today about my observations on funding for Indigenous specific services. I served from December of 1987 to June of 1990. From the beginning of 1989 to mid-1990, I was under investigation for security concerns as part of what is now known as the LGBT purge, and was offered an honorable discharge that stated I was not advantageously employable due to homosexuality. When I was released in 1990, I was told that I was not a veteran and I would never receive veteran services. So I did not engage in any veteran services for the next 25 years. It was my connection to the Métis that brought me back to the veteran family. When I lived in Toronto, I became engaged with the Métis Nation of Ontario and served as the chair of the Toronto and York Region Métis Council. Early in my involvement, I received a call from the late Joe Paquette. Joe was a Métis elder, and he served as the president of the Métis Nation Ontario Veterans Council. He called me up one day, and we had a long talk. He asked why I wasn't involved with the Métis veterans. I explained my experience with the LGBT purge and my fear of engaging with veterans as a queer person. I was also told that on release I was not a veteran, that I didn't feel like a veteran, and I would not feel welcomed within any veteran community as a queer person. He responded, he lectured me actually, and responded that a veteran is a veteran is a veteran. And with open arms, I was welcomed into the Métis Veterans Council as a member, and he invited me to march with the Métis veterans at the Louis Riel Day ceremony at Queen's Park. So for the first time in 25 years, I put on my beret and marched in a parade. This was uncomfortable for me in the beginning, and I still feel trepidation when connecting with other veterans. But the Métis Veterans Council has been incredibly supportive. Since that time, I've had a few opportunities to connect with other Indigenous veterans and see the value of those opportunities to connect for engagement, ceremony, and healing. In 2017, I was able to attend the 100th anniversary of Vimy in Ottawa alongside other Métis veterans. This gathering provided an opportunity to meet, to share experiences, and to learn the involvement of the Métis people in the First World War. Part of the trip even included a visit to the Canadian War Museum, where we were able to see the Indigenous contributions on display. In 2013, I was invited to travel to the National Indigenous Day events in Winnipeg, alongside Algonquins of Pikwakanagan veteran Wendy Jocko, to represent veterans at the APTN Live event. We interacted with numerous Indigenous veterans over the 2 days, and were even able to bring some of the veterans to the Veteran Affairs Services table to ensure they got connected. Earlier this year, I attended the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Juno Beach. I was there on behalf of Rainbow Veterans of Canada, but was pleased to be alongside representatives from other Indigenous veteran groups. These connections were again invaluable, and the inclusion not only highlighted the contributions of Indigenous people in these conflicts, but provided space for ceremony, for healing, and for recognition. In August of this year, VAC supported a 2S LGBTQI+ Veterans Forum in Fredericton, New Brunswick. At the event, we were able to invite Wolastoqey Grand Chief Ron Trombe to lead a talking circle with Two-Spirit veterans and other LGBTQI+ veterans. It was an incredible experience for all who participated, and I believe the first time I've been able to be in a ceremonial space with other queer Indigenous veterans. Each of these examples highlights opportunities to connect with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis veterans connecting together, opportunities for engagement, opportunities for ceremony, and opportunities for healing. Connections to community are extremely important for creating opportunities for holistic healing. Although I'm not directly involved with the governance of the Métis veterans, I know a barrier to more inclusion is the lack of available funding to support Indigenous veteran groups. Funds that could be used to reduce barriers by bringing together Métis veterans in community and reducing barriers for connecting with other Indigenous veteran organizations. I want to point out that the relationship with the VAC leadership team has been stellar. Through my volunteer work as a veteran, I've always felt a strong partnership. I'm incredibly thankful to VAC for the opportunities that they've provided, for gatherings to share as 2S LGBTQI+ veterans, as well as women veterans. I'm not aware of similar opportunities for Indigenous veterans or for specifically First Nation, Inuit, or Métis veterans to gather as distinctive communities, but this is something that I would recommend. I will leave it there, Chair, so I can speak in the questions to some of my own personal experiences in accessing veteran services, but recognizing I'm out of time, I'll pass the floor back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross, and it's interesting to listen to your career, your courage, your story. So now let's go to Mrs. Danielle Tillett. She's an historian. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Tanchikiawau. Hello, my name is Danielle Teye. I am Red River Métis and settler, originally from Treaty 1 territory. I now live here on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I'm also the inaugural historian of Indigenous military history at the Canadian War Museum. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to speak and contribute to this important study. As a historian, I can offer an overview of the experiences of Indigenous veterans of the two world wars. That's my area of expertise, though I'm not well positioned to speak to contemporary issues as Todd Ross just did. Understanding the historical context of Indigenous military service can provide us with crucial insights into present-day issues. As you can imagine, 5 minutes can only scratch the surface of this complex history, which is already quite well documented in the committee's 2019 report on Indigenous veterans and other reports. To understand the challenges Indigenous service people faced, it's critical to consider the broader context of how Indigenous people were treated in general through systemic discrimination and colonial policies and legislation. The government and society's treatment of Indigenous veterans was inextricably linked to the treatment of Indigenous people in general. The number of Indigenous people to serve in 20th century conflicts are elusive. Approximately 4,000 status Indians served for Canada in the First World War, and an estimated 4,200 served in the Second World War. Thousands more non-status First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people enlisted without official recognition of their indigeneity. There were certain barriers that shaped the enlistment and service of Indigenous people during this era. For example, initially during the First World War, First Nations people were dissuaded by the government from enlisting. This was based partly on unfavorable and racist depictions in popular literature at the time, which led to a paternalistic logic that Germans might refuse to extend the supposed privileges of civilized warfare to First Nation soldiers. In the Second World War, recruitment for the Navy and Air Force initially required enlistees to be, quote, of pure European descent and of the white race, end quote. Restrictive policies like these were not applied universally, and as casualties mounted during both wars, these types of barriers were abandoned in an effort to boost recruitment. For many Indigenous individuals who served during this era, their wartime service was the first time they had experienced a sense of equality with their white settler peers. But they would return to Canada after their service to the same discrimination they would have known before they enlisted. Indigenous veterans did not generally receive equal treatment after returning to civilian life. Status Indian veterans, specifically, returned home to life as wards of the state. Restrictions such as the prohibition on the sale of alcohol to Status Indians meant that many First Nations veterans were not able to participate in Legion activities since liquor was served at many functions. Moreover, the right to vote federally did not come for Status Indian men until 1960. They did not have the full rights and benefits of citizenship under Canada's Indian Act, but had enlisted to go to war for Canada anyway. There was a shared feeling by many Indigenous veterans that there was a disconnect between the significance of their wartime service and sacrifices and the political, economic, and social realities they returned home to. This was in large part because they were excluded in many cases from accessing veterans' supports. Pensions and benefits, such as land and financial grants that were set up to support veterans after both wars, were notionally available to all veterans. However, most Indigenous claims were denied. Some veterans even returned home from the First World War to find that the reserve lands of their communities had shrunk or disappeared entirely. The federal government acquired more than 85,000 acres of reserve land in Western Canada for the settlement of non-Indigenous veterans after the war. These injustices had lasting impacts on many Indigenous veterans, some of whom went on to organize politically and lobby for Indigenous and veterans' rights after their service. These experiences are well documented in the literature and in interviews with Indigenous veterans, including through the Canadian War Museum's In Their Own Voices project, which includes dozens of interviews with Indigenous identified veterans. Hopefully, this very brief historical overview has provided some context as you explore more contemporary issues in this study. The challenges Indigenous veterans faced in the post-World War era's discriminatory, social, legislative, and policy structures persisted for a long time, as did the lack of recognition they experienced. Marcy, and thank you for your time.
Thank you much, Mrs. Tillett. Well, 5 minutes, I know it's really short, but it's important for us to listen to you. You may know that we had a study on veterans women's, and we issued 42 recommendations. So we said, hey, we should have a study on Indigenous and Black to see what's going on. So now we're going to start the first round of questions. It's going to be for 6 minutes each. And I invite Mr. Blake Richards, he's the Vice President of the committee. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, both of you, for your testimony. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Teye. You know, some of the things that you shared with us, historical things that you shared with us, I mean, they're shocking to hear. When you hear that kind of discrimination, it's actually hard for us to even fathom in today's day and age some of the types of discrimination you were talking about, especially when you're talking about people who went to serve their country, despite the fact that maybe their country didn't really acknowledge them and their backgrounds. What I'd like to do, though, is jump, I guess, a little closer to the present. This committee previously studied the experience of Indigenous veterans, and unfortunately, like has often been the case with this government, they accepted a number of the recommendations that this committee made and then never followed through with them. This practice really of not keeping promises, I think, is really at the core of the conversation around reconciliation. So I wanted your thoughts on how damaging it is, how demoralizing it is to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to see a government acknowledge their issues, promise to fix them, and then never bother to follow through.
That's a great point. And obviously, I'm not a veteran myself. I can't speak for others, although I have studied numerous interviews with and oral histories with Indigenous veterans. And I think there's a real frustration. It's not just about, I mean, some of it's about financial supports, but it's not just about that. It's about recognition of the contributions that they've made. And I think reconciliation is a process. It's not a one and done. It's not something that can sort of be an event and then we're finished with it. And I think that's where some of the frustration is coming from. Or there are veterans, there are, in some cases, residential school survivors who are also veterans. They're implementing the truth, part of the Truth and Reconciliation, and I think it's on us as institutions to implement the reconciliation part and to follow through. I think it's a lot easier to say the right things than it is to follow through and to do the right things.
Certainly it is, and it's important that when someone makes a promise, they follow through with it. So, thank you for highlighting that, Mr. Ross. If I can turn to you, first of all, thank you for your service. Thank you for your perseverance, and you know, I appreciate that, you know, you had others help to push you to get involved in the veteran community, and it's the veteran community is better for you being a part of it. So thank you for taking the advice that a veteran is a veteran is a veteran, because it's very true. And what I'd like to ask you about is, I believe you've served either on the board or have been involved with a couple of different organizations that deal with housing issues for vulnerable populations, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, I have served in the past. Yep.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, because I mean, I hear a lot these days about homeless veterans. I mean, there's more and more organizations cropping up to kind of fill the needs there are for housing for veterans who are finding themselves underhoused or homeless. And one of the things that I hear sometimes, fairly regularly actually, is that there are veterans out there who have, you know, in some cases thousands of dollars worth of benefits that might be available to them from Veterans Affairs, but they're unable to access them because they're either not aware of them, or they don't have an address or a way to access a MyVac account. You know, they don't have any way to access those kinds of things. So I wondered if you could just talk from your experience dealing with housing issues. For someone, you know, particularly a veteran in this case, that's suffering from mental health issues or physical ailments, can cumbersome bureaucratic processes and paperwork stand as a barrier for them to be able to access the help they need?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My experience in housing has been through a few boards and current boards that I'm on, where we support some veterans who are in need of supports. I think one of the important things for housing is the wraparound services that keep people housed. Often what I've found with some of the veterans that we work with is they get into a place where they are getting housed, but then other pieces of their life are falling, and as a result, they're at risk of losing housing. Some of the barriers, of course, you know, social determinants of health, with lack of access to communications or strong relationships with the Veteran Affairs offices, people often fall through the cracks. And it's a lot of organizations that kind of step in to support people when they have connections.
Can I just, sorry, I've been indicated I've got very limited time left, and you touched on a point that I think is an important one there that I wanted to follow up on just a little bit. Do you think that, like, when it comes to those kinds of services, do you think that Veterans Affairs could be more proactive in helping veterans before they fall into homelessness?
again, I think there's so many challenges around when you're looking at homelessness, and particularly with veterans. My experience is that homelessness tends to be one issue that people are dealing with. I think that my experience has been there's been a lot of supports from VAC, but they don't always reach the people in a timely manner.
Right.
And that's because of these other complications that could be involved. When we've alerted VAC that there's an issue, they've been very responsive. But it's identifying those individuals who are falling through the cracks, who, if they're connected with an organization, the organization can often support, but a lot of times.
Right. And I guess that's
They're
what I
not.
was getting at. Could they be more proactive in helping to
Thank
identify
you.
who those people are?
Thank you. 6-minute time is up.
Can you just be given a brief opportunity to respond to that?
Mr. Ross, 15 seconds if you would like to react to that.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that with a lot of services, there needs to be adaptability, and sometimes with bureaucracy, they can't be as adaptable. So I would encourage all departments to be more adaptable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now for 6 minutes, let's go to MP Sarai, Randip Sarai. 5 minutes. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both witnesses. I'll go to Ms. Tillet first. I understand you had the opportunity to support a documentary which is available on CBC Gem called Indian Braves. This project went across the country to meet veterans and their families to hear their stories of their life in the Canadian military. Could you share more about this project and how our committee, with our committee, and why projects like these are very important for Canadians?
Yes, thank you for the question. I believe that documentary, as you said, it was called Indian Braves. It aired nationwide on CBC on Remembrance Day last year, which was very exciting for us at the War Museum. I think these projects are so critical to build awareness in broader mainstream society. For me, I research this stuff. I live this stuff. I work in it every day. Sort of like I'm sure how you work on the Veterans Affairs Committee. You live in these veterans affairs. This is a big part of your agenda. But I think for the average person, it's not something that there's a great awareness of. I just gave a talk actually on Friday to a group in Ottawa. And we just talked about why do we have Indigenous Veterans Day, for example, which is coming up next Friday, November 8th. And there's a lack of awareness, and a lot of people, I think, question why we have a separate day for Indigenous veterans. And it's an interesting question, but I think it comes down to having knowledge about the historical foundations. Some of the stuff I spoke about and the stuff that I elaborated on a little bit more in the documentary, just the complete lack of recognition of the contributions of Indigenous service people, and fundamentally the sacrifices that they made, the lack of supports, the lack of recognition for status Indians, the lack of full citizenship rights until after the Second World War, until 1960. And I think with more awareness, as they say, if we know better, we can do better. And I think that the more that the general public understands about these historical foundations, the more momentum that we can build and hopefully improve the lives of current veterans, contemporary veterans. Thank you.
Thank you. I just went to a Sikh Remembrance Day ceremony in Kitchener this weekend, and it reminded me of what you said. There was a lot of people who were not allowed to join the military but joined, and there was like a pass, I guess, because they just needed people, and they felt that way they'll be integrated, they'll be respected more. But as you said, sometimes when you came back, it was not. And in this case, I think there was 10 in total from the Sikh Indian community that joined on behalf of Canada at the time. Can you provide an overview of the historical participation of Indigenous peoples in the military, including key conflicts and contributions, just so we have a context of which battles and wars or the numbers that have participated?
Yeah, absolutely. So the numbers are, as I alluded to in my presentation, the numbers are elusive. there were Indigenous people serving alongside colonial forces in the 7 Years' War, in the War of 1812. There were Indigenous people who went to the Nile expedition. There were, and so there's a precedent here long before the First World War. And so that was actually a motivation for a lot of Indigenous people to enlist, was seeing this as a part of their relationship with the Crown through elements such as treaties and previous military alliances. And even the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which recognizes First Nations sovereign status. Yeah, and of course, I think Veterans Affairs at this point estimates that in 20th century conflict, there are about 12,000 Indigenous people who have served. But again, due to the lack of recognition of the indigeneity of, let's say, Métis people, for example, during conflict, I don't know that we'll ever have tallies, like real numbers, to suggest how many people served. And in fact, I read an account of a Second World War veteran who talked about his Métis nationhood not being recognized when he enlisted. They said, well, what part European are you? What type of European are you? And he said, well, French. And they wrote French on his paper, but they said there's no such thing as Métis. And that was a real frustration for him. And he talked about that when he was a veteran. So these are historical issues I'm speaking to, but they're real issues. Yeah.
1 minute. I'll go to you, Mr. Ross. How can Indigenous communities be more involved in shaping the policies and programs that affect the veterans, and how Indigenous veterans are commemorated and remembered?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Mr. Chair, I mentioned that there's currently a women's forum, and there's currently a 2S LGBTQI plus forum that Veteran Affairs organizes each year. It would be my recommendation that we begin having an Indigenous forum, or we begin having a specific First Nation forum, Métis forum, and Inuit forum that brings together veterans from those communities where we can share our experiences, as well as continue to build our connections contemporarily across the nation. I think with the existing forums that are happening, it's a great opportunity to find out where the frustrations are and where the solutions are. So I'd highly recommend that happen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross. And maintenant, nous allons passer au...
We are now going to move on to the second vice chair, Mr. Luc Desilets, who has 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our two guests for accepting to be here. Miss Tia, I hope that I've pronounced your name correctly. You alluded to the fact that Indigenous veterans did not have the same rights as others. Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, so thank you for the question. When I said Indigenous veterans didn't have the same rights, it's more broadly Indigenous people didn't have the same rights. So when we talk about First Nations, status Indians returning from the First and Second World War, they were wards of the state, so they did not have the right to vote. And so for example, when conscription came up in the First World War and the Second World War, there was a lot of resistance from Indigenous communities, First Nations communities in particular, to say, we are the wards. How can we be compelled to go and fight if we are the supposed child and you are the supposed parent, in essence? How can you compel us? And so during the First World War, there was actually an exemption made due to the resistance by First Nations communities to suggest that treaty Indians would not be compelled by conscription. That was not successful during the Second World War and the Natural Resources Mobilization Act. Yeah, and so does that answer your question?
Okay. We know that Indigenous people contributed to the war efforts, But there's also a bit of a dark history, because we also know that Indigenous people lost thousands of acres of their land during the wars, correct?
Yes. Yeah. About 85,000, at least 85,000 acres of reserve land was purchased by the federal government during the First World War for the settlement of non-Indigenous veterans when they would return home. And unfortunately, the funds used to purchase that land didn't even go to the communities, specifically to the bands, to the communities. It was held in trust by the government to spend as it saw fit. And this is sort of a theme that exists throughout history with especially status Indians, is this stereotype, this paternalistic approach that suggests that Indigenous people don't know how to spend money, don't know how to be responsible with funds. And so we as the government will hold on to that money for you. And that is seen as one of many reasons why some Indigenous people did not receive access to pensions and benefits. Was it was seen as, well, you don't need that much money. It was a very paternalistic approach towards Indigenous people.
Avez-vous des...
Why did the government do that at that time? I'm having a hard time understanding. It seems like theft.
Je suis naïf.
Perhaps I'm a little naive.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is hard to understand but this is where I come back to what I initially said. We have to look at, if we're looking at this history of Indigenous veterans, this is inextricably linked from the treatment of the government towards Indigenous people overall. And so this is just one element of that treatment. So when we think about, so when I mentioned in my talk that initially in the First World War, Indigenous veterans or Indigenous people were dissuaded from enlisting, eventually that policy was reversed in part because military service was seen as a tool of assimilation. This was seen as a way to get Indigenous people to integrate into mainstream society, to enfranchise, to give up their treaty rights and their status. And so this is all part of the history of the government and the Crown's approach to Indigenous people. This is just a small part of what colonialism and colonialism and the British Crown and then Canada's approach towards Indigenous people. But it's hard to wrap your mind around, for sure.
L'enrôlement, là on parle de la Deuxième Guerre.
Now, for the Second World War, enrollment was voluntary, correct?
Absolutely.
Vous avez fait référence dans...
Earlier, you referred to the report that was tabled by this committee in 2019. Perhaps you read the recommendations. Can you let me know if it was a useful report? Were any of those recommendations implemented?
Thank you for the question. I did not get a chance to read the recommendations. I read through the historical section, so I don't actually know what the recommendations were. But I can say that the historical foundation from the report is solid.
Si vous aviez une recommandation...
If you had one recommendation to make to this committee regarding what Indigenous veterans faced and continue to face, what would it be?
I would say the most important thing would be to talk to the veterans themselves or the groups who are representing them. Almost all Indigenous governments and communities have veterans organizations. There are First Nations, there's a First Nations Veterans Council with the Assembly of First Nations. I believe almost all, if not all of the Métis governments have veterans organizations, and they deal directly with these veterans, and they would have a really good idea, I think, of the needs and the challenges.
Merci, Monsieur Désiré.
Thank you, Mr. Désiré.
To invite Ms. Bliney for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I thank both of our witness and Mr. Ross. I want to thank you for your service. I'm going to come to you first. I want to make sure I'm saying your name right. Is it Ms. Ta'a?
It's Teye.
Te'e. Te'e. Thank you. Ms. Te'e, I really appreciate your testimony today, and I think it's really important. And I think of the First Nations people who lost status because of their service. And I come from it from a very personal experience. My granny was in residential school in Lejac, and they married her off at 16 without any consent from her. And of course, you immediately lose your status. And so for my granny, what that meant was that when her father was dying, she couldn't go home without permission from the Indian agent. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the impact was when these veterans came home and they couldn't participate in their community in the same way if they gave up their status.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, in my understanding of the research that I've done, in large part, and I said in my presentation, you know, generally speaking, access to supports was not equal, but there were Indigenous veterans who did receive supports, and by and large, they were people who were participating willingly or unwillingly in the assimilation agenda. So there were people who were willing to potentially, as I believe it says in the initial report, veterans report that you have for this committee, willing to move to a specific community, willing to enfranchise and lose their status. And that can be a disconnect from culture, from community. And on the other hand, if veterans did not choose to give that up, to leave their communities, on the other hand, then they didn't receive supports. They were cut off. They had to rely on their Indian agent for information of how to access benefits and pensions, and that was often not forthcoming. And so I think that's a real issue, for sure.
So my next question is, you were very clear about the area of your study, and I appreciate that. But I'm wondering, you talked a lot about the systemic discrimination and racism, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how that systemic discrimination and racism continues forward, and what the impacts it may have had on the current realities that veterans face.
Thank you for that question. As a historian, I tend to think in the past. I don't think I have a question. I don't think I have an answer that could do your question justice. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's fair enough. I'm going to go to Mr. Ross. I really appreciated you sharing your story with us. And I guess the first thing, I just want to make sure that we're clear about what the LGBT purge was. So could you just, I know it's hard to sum it up really short, but I think it's really important that there be clarity for the report on what that is.
Sure, yeah, I'll do the elevator pitch. So the LGBT purge between the mid-50s and up to until around 1996 was the systemic discrimination of queer people within the federal civil service, the military, and the RCMP. So it included investigations, it included interrogations, sometimes just harassment. Thousands of people were fired from their jobs, and most people like myself received an honorable discharge that said not advantageously employable due to homosexuality. So it was tied into the McCarthy era. Canada continued it on until it was ended by a court case in 1992 by Michelle Douglas.
Thank you so much for that. So in your particular story that you did share with us earlier, it sounded like quite a horrific and terrifying experience. And I'm just wondering, as a Métis person dealing with this from the military, how was that for you? Because I would expect that from the queer perspective and from a Métis experience perspective, it would have a really particular impact. And I'm just wondering if you could share that with the committee.
Yeah, and certainly from the time, it was more of the impact as a queer person. That was the focus of the investigation, and that was the challenge. As I moved along in my life, though, the further challenge is, as I look for support, is I'm a veteran, I'm gay, and I'm Métis. Try and find a service provider who has the proficiency to work with a queer Métis veteran. I can pick one lane. I can usually find somebody who's Métis. I can find somebody who works with veterans, or I can find somebody who works with queer people. It's rare that you can find two of those together, and almost impossible to find all three of those together. So you always have to kind of put two of your identities aside to get support for any one of your identities. So that's a real challenge right now. Providing cultural safety for service providers, though, is one way around that. So it doesn't always fall on the individual to have to explain to somebody what a Métis person is, what the health disparities for Métis people are, or what are the complications for somebody who's gay, or what are the services provided for somebody who's veteran if I go to a queer service provider. So those are the real challenges within those three distinct communities that are faced.
Heard very clearly from you is that really having an opportunity to come together with other Indigenous veterans and having a clear perspective from the collective would be very helpful for services for VAC. I'm just wondering if you could talk about what you've heard from the work that you've been doing within the Indigenous veterans community and what you feel would be appropriate for VAC to start hearing about.
Mr. Ross, you have only 30 seconds to answer that question.
About that, Todd.
Sorry.
Okay.
Please.
No worries. Certainly from the Indigenous community, from the Indigenous veterans community, there's been tremendous support. But it's kind of, we're just getting to meet each other. We're just getting to find each other through some of these opportunities that I've had in the past. Having more opportunities across organizations, I think is incredibly important. Those opportunities to have dialogue, to find out what the common problems are and where we can support each other.
Hugh, thank you very much. And we're going to go to a second round, and with intervention, 5 minutes both, and 2 minutes and a half at the end. And I'm going to start with, I don't know, Mrs. Rogenthal. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. I appreciate having you, both of you here, and for your service as well, Todd. Thank you. I want to begin with the question for yourself, Ms. Telliot. We did do the study in 2019, had the opportunity to travel. It was excellent, right across the country and up north to where the ranges were. And one of our recommendations was that Veterans Affairs Canada provide the House of Commons Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs with an explanation of the reasons that a settlement agreement was not reached to compensate Métis veterans of the Second World War and their families. And the rationale was that budget 2019, which is in the year we did this, the Government of Canada proposed $30 million to recognize the contribution of Métis veterans to the country's Second World War efforts and to commemorate the sacrifices and achievements of all Métis veterans. Now, I'm wondering if you can answer this for me, because I asked, in the past, how was the $30 million proposed to recognize that contribution, and how was it spent? And the funding went to only one organization, and the Métis people who were not affiliated with that group, of course, were incredibly disappointed with that. Do you, with your background in history, do you know what organization it was that actually received that money? $30 million?
No, unfortunately, I don't know.
I guess I'll have to do the research on that myself. Okay, thank you. But that just shows a certain disconnect there, obviously, because you're talking about individuals of a group, our Métis folks who went over and did serve incredibly for Canada and then failed to get the recognition still that they deserve. So this, in other words, that recommendation hasn't been completed, correct? Well, thank you, Chair. I was going to go to him next. Ever so briefly, because I do have another one I'm really quite excited to ask. Ross, can you give me any feedback on that?
Yeah, I do know through my involvement with the Métis National Council, through the Métis Nation of Ontario, that there was a Métis veteran organization created under the Métis National Council, that they were distributing funds to World War II Métis veterans. I believe that that fund still exists, and I think if you go to MétisVeterans.ca, that's where that's the remnants of the group that received the funds.
Follow up on that. That's very
Sorry?
helpful. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. I will follow up on that. That's very helpful because we do want to make sure that all who served are recognized and have that support extended to their families. I have another question. I had the opportunity to meet in November 28th of 2023 with the Housing and Renewal Association, and it represents the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporation. And these two very impressive young women came to my office, Alma Arguello, she's with Brantford Native Housing, and Sarah McBain, who is with Northern Housing. And they talked to me about the challenges that they face. And of course, this is urban housing for Indigenous peoples, not on reserve. So the promise was made in 2019, I believe, for $4 billion from the federal government to them. And at this time in 2023, they were still waiting. And so they were very concerned because the housing stock was deteriorating, and they indicated that the government seemed to try to conflate First Nations funding and urban housing issues. And so almost like that same expectation, well, you already have money, it's over here towards housing. But that has to be spent on First Nation reserves. So it was very confusing to them. And so they talked about the barriers that CMHC has placed on First Nation communities, and they kept asking about this money. They had 60 signatories of Indigenous housing organizations within NICHI. So they felt that the Minister Fraser, was continually stalling, and they were disappointed with his remarks that day. And at this point, they just felt there was so much bureaucratic oversight. So they eventually got some funds from CMHC, and they suggested they start in Ontario. However, we know the housing circumstances in Ontario, and they were given between $150,000 and $200,000, and they said to me, we couldn't even deal with the permits, let alone the cost of the housing, which was going to be $445 up to now $550 per square foot. So the money was not there. I don't believe it's there yet. So what do we do when we don't get the funding that is needed for urban Indigenous folks? And of course, we heard from you, Ross, the importance of that housing and that foundation. So I have 0 seconds left.
Maybe a short reaction from Mr. Ross for this.
Or how about 30
Mrs.
seconds
Taylor?
each? How about 30 seconds each?
So let ask Mr. Ross to
kind of a
a
big
quick
deal.
reaction, please.
Yeah, and certainly, I'm not in my traditional territory. I live on the East Coast. My community is on the West. So living in an urban Indigenous community, there's very little access to urban Indigenous housing, period, let alone urban Indigenous housing for veterans. So yes, it would be very helpful to have more resources for
Thank you.
housing.
Thank you so much. So now for 5 minutes, Mr. Sean Kessé.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Taye, I don't have a question for you, but I want to recount this for you. Back when the House of Commons sat in centre block, one of the nicest things that you get to do as a member of Parliament is when people come up to Ottawa, and you're able to give them a tour. And it was even more so back when everything was in centre block. And one of the standard things that I did on every single one of those tours is I took them over to the Senate chamber, where the bust of James Gladstone was there on display, and explained to them that this fellow was a senator before he had the right to vote. And to a person, they were aghast to hear that. And I guess what I would say to you is hearing your opening statement and to
telling us of the history that very much lines up with that example, to me underlines the importance of your work. So maybe I will add a question in there. What can the government do to help you in your work? Are there certain areas in Indigenous military history that require more support? This is your chance.
Well, thank you for the question. I will say it's a growing field, but there are a lot of gaps in the sort of academic literature, as far as, I mean, I don't even think I could go into how many areas that still need exploration. At the Canadian War Museum right now, one of our projects is we are looking at a renewal. The Canadian War Museum, where it sits right now, is about coming up on 20 years there. And so we actually, and I'm relatively new, I've been in my position for 2 years, and we're looking for ways to enhance diversity in the museum in our permanent displays. We're already doing it in our temporary exhibitions, but in our permanent displays, we want to see more history on, especially, of course, I do, that's why I'm there, more on Indigenous contributions and Black Canadians as well, which I know is part of your study. And so we're going through a process where we are reviewing what we have on display and what requires reinterpretation, and what are potentially entirely gaps, for example, that are not included, are not on display, things that we aren't talking about enough. And so I'd imagine there needs to be a budget for this rather lofty project. So if there's interest in the government contributing to that, of course, I'm sure there would be great interest from us at the museum to be able to enhance essentially the educational tools, enhance our exhibitions to be able to share with all Canadians and all visitors this really critical and important history. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Ross, thank you for your service and thank you for being here with us today. In the course of your work and your advocacy, do you have occasion to deal directly with individual veterans who are struggling or in need of help from Veterans Affairs Canada?
Yeah, I'm co-chair of Rainbow Veterans of Canada, as well as co-chair of the LGBT Purge Fund. In my role at Rainbow Veterans of Canada, we work directly with a number of veterans and some who need services.
Okay. And so in the course of that frontline work, are you aware that Veterans Affairs Canada works with homeless veterans? Yes, aware of that. And we've been able to refer veterans who have had difficulty. Again, once they get connected, the services are amazing that they're able to assist. And I expect either through your work or through your advice that veterans are advised, if they have served, that it is as simple as reaching out to Veterans Affairs to determine what might be available for them.
Yes, and well, the complications become when, particularly people who are living with issues around mental health, that sometimes that relationship piece is tough to build. So just simply reaching out sometimes isn't that easy. Oh.
Thank you very much. I guess that underlines the importance of your work, which we very much appreciate, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kissy. Et maintenant, Monsieur Luc Désir.
And now moving on to Mr. Luc Desilets, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Ross, my questions are for you. Earlier you talked about the lack of funding compared to other veterans. What is different? What did you mean by that exactly?
So I believe support for the Indigenous organizations, specifically for Métis organizations to gather together, that there are not a lot of supports for those organizations. It's been a challenge with Métis governments to get support. I know that there's still negotiations with the Government of Canada that the supports are building, but Métis veterans specifically, it's been taking a long time, from my understanding, for the organizations to get supports where they can then work with Métis veterans specifically as part of the organization.
Merci. Avec
Thank you. Mr. Ross, would you say that the return to civilian life for Métis veterans is more difficult than for other types of veterans?
Yes, and I think it depends on the circumstance of the individual. I think that for some, it would be very easy to return, and those would be people who maybe have more resources. For other Métis veterans, connecting back into to a society where Métis people from the very beginning have to face with the effects of colonization, that there are so many challenges already in place that as a veteran, you're also confronting all of those challenges, in addition to challenges just simply because you're a veteran.
Dernière petite question, Monsieur Ross.
Last question, Mr. Ross. Do you believe that there are more Indigenous veterans that are homeless than other veterans?
My assumption would be yes, just simply due to the social determinants of health. And because there are more issues affecting Indigenous veterans, my assumption that there would be a higher representation of Indigenous veterans who are homeless.
Merci.
Merci, Monsieur Desilets. Et pour
Thank you, Mr. Desilets. And to end, we will have questions from Ms. Blaney.
2 minutes and a half.
I love
please.
getting the last word most of the time. Mr. Ross, I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm going to come and ask one more question here in the room. But I really appreciated what you had to say about accessing the services and how sometimes mental health can have an impact on a veteran's capacity to ask for help. One of the things that I've been pushing for is more training in trauma-informed care for VAC staff, and perhaps even having specialized trauma-informed service providers that when a complex case comes to them, that they actually have the training to deal with that and deal with those issues. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on if that would be a way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge is when you go to a Veteran Affairs office that sometimes some of the caseworkers may be very proficient in trauma-informed care. Whether you get that case manager or not, though, is a bit of a gamble. So the challenge is, particularly the veterans that we've been working with, is trying to identify if there is somebody in that particular office who's going to be able to assist in a safe way, and trying to identify who those people are and trying to get the person in front of them.
Thank you. That's so helpful. So my last question, and I forgot to say last time that the War Museum is my favorite museum. I've been there several times, and I'm not just saying that to be complimentary. I just find it such a powerful museum, and it's so educational. So I want to come back to that part, though, that reconciliation is really more about action. And I believe that a huge part of reconciliation is education, because a lot of the racist comments that people make are based in their total lack of understanding. So I'm just wondering, how could this committee and Canada incorporate Indigenous history in a way that honors reconciliation? We need a recommendation for this, so I would really appreciate just your thoughts.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. I think, so how can you incorporate? I don't think I don't know if I have an answer at the tip of my tongue. I think yes, you're really hitting me with the most difficult questions.
So I know
here.
my time is almost up, but could you consider that and maybe send a response back to the committee? Because I think it is really important. You know, when people hear from you, some of this history you told us today, even in the committee, you could see people were shocked by that. And I think that is part of the importance of reconciliation is bringing a hidden history forward.
Yes.
So that it's no longer an Indigenous story, but a Canadian story. And I think we haven't made that transition yet. So if you could just maybe think from that historic lens and give your thoughts to us, it would be really appreciated here in this committee.
Absolutely. I know from a museum perspective, obviously, I think the War Museum is moving that direction, especially with the creation of my position and the work that I'm doing there. That's a real effort, is to try and do these things. We hold programs on Indigenous Veterans Day where we try to elaborate on this stuff. But I don't know if right off the top of my head I have a recommendation for the committee. So I'll give that some thought. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. So do not hesitate to send to the clerk any additional information. And you too, Mr. Ross. So I'd like to thank you for your appearance, but I'm pretty sure that in our audience today we have some young people. I'm pretty sure that they know a little bit more about indigenous veterans because they were there with us for an hour. And don't forget, before you leave, you're going to have to do the exam to make sure that you... Well, on behalf of the committee, members of the committee and myself, I'd like to thank both of the witnesses. Nous avions au début...
We had with us as an individual Mr. Todd Ross, and from the Canadian War Museum, Ms. Danielle Tillet, historian. I would also like to thank our technical team, our interpreters, our clerk, and our analyst. Meeting adjourned.